Sirens echoed through the narrow streets of Antananarivo, the capital of Madagascar. Young voices rose above the chaos, thousands chanting in unison, Mala Halo, meaning enough is enough. The air trembled with the sound of defiance, and then before the cameras of the BBC One man turned that defiance into destiny. Colonel Michael Randrian Arena, a soldier with the calm of a priest and the resolve of a mountain, faced a journalist who asked him to speak in French Madagascar's so-called official language. He paused, looked straight into the lens, and said with quiet fire, "Why can't I speak my language?" Malagasi. In that single moment, he didn't just reject a language, he rejected centuries of chains. Within hours, Paris was in panic. Western analysts called it a dangerous populist signal, but across Africa, millions called it something else: freedom. For over a century, France had called the shots from the Indian Ocean to the Sahel. Madagascar was their jewel rich in vanilla cobalt and strategic ports. Yet, in the blink of an eye, this 51-year-old colonel had turned that jewel into a spark. A spark that could set the last colonial bridges ablaze. This wasn't a coup, not in the way the West likes to label it. This was a refoundation, a revolution wrapped in olive drab, led not by generals hungry for power, but by youth hungry for dignity. And as the world scrambles to understand what's unfolding on this island, one question now echoes louder than the sirens. Is Colonel Randrian Arena's rebellion the final blow to France's empire in Africa, or the beginning of a new dawn for the continent? Stay with me till the end, because what happened in Madagascar this week is more than a headline. It's the pulse of a continent reclaiming its voice. It didn't begin with tanks or gunfire. It began with teenagers holding smartphones. 2 weeks before Colonel Randrian Arena appeared on television, Antananarivo's narrow streets filled with restless young faces. They weren't carrying rifles or party flags, only banners scrawled with the words, "Mala Halo, enough is enough." The movement started small. A few students protesting blackouts that left their homes in darkness for days. Then, the water stopped running. Food prices doubled. And suddenly, the whispers became a roar. Within days, tens of thousands poured into the capital's Independence Avenue, a generation born after independence but raised under its broken promises. For them, the enemy wasn't abstract. It had a name and a face: President André Rajoelina, the smooth-talking businessman who seized power in 2009 and returned through questionable elections in 2018. He had promised progress. What he delivered was poverty. While his palaces glittered with imported chandeliers, 3 out of 4 Malagasi citizens lived below the poverty line. The youth, jobless, voiceless, and wired into the digital world, saw every lie in real time. They live-streamed corruption, filmed police brutality, and organized through encrypted chats. This wasn't their grandparents' protest. It was Generation Z's rebellion, and their weapon was exposure. By the first week of October, tension had reached a boiling point. The government tried to silence them, blocking networks, arresting organizers, threatening journalists. But it was too late. Then came the moment that changed everything. On October 11th, the president ordered the CAPSAT, Madagascar's elite military unit, to restore order. Its commander was Colonel Michael Randrian Arena, a quiet man from the drought-scorched south known among soldiers for his discipline and loyalty. Many expected him to follow orders blindly. He didn't. Instead of marching against the youth, he drove with them. Eyewitnesses said his convoy stopped at the heart of the protest near Independence Square. Soldiers stepped out of their trucks and joined the chants. That single act flipped the nation's story upside down. CAPSAT, the same force that once propped up Rajoelina in 2009, had turned against him in 2025. Within hours, panic swept through the presidential palace. Ministers fled, police stations emptied, and Rajoelina disappeared, reportedly evacuated on a French military aircraft bound for Paris. As he vanished into exile, the irony was impossible to ignore. The man who once claimed to represent Malagasi pride was running toward his colonial patrons for safety. By October 12th, the National Assembly voted to impeach him in a whirlwind session. Protesters surrounded the building, cheering and singing the national anthem in Malagasi, not French. The military held its ground, but this time not as oppressors. They stood as guardians of the people. That same night, Colonel Randrian Arena addressed the nation from the steps of the presidential palace, the same red fortress that had symbolized decades of betrayal. His uniform was spotless, his tone calm, almost humble. "CAPSAT is taking over," he declared. not for power, but for the refoundation of the Republic of Madagascar. No fireworks, no victory parade, just a soldier, his people, and a promise. The next morning, the Constitutional Court, still adorned with colonial-era architecture, ratified his leadership. For the first time in decades, Malagasi citizens felt that history was being rewritten not by outsiders, not by billionaires, but by one of their own. And as dawn broke over the highlands, the same youths who had been beaten, tear-gassed, and ignored for years gathered once again. They didn't carry protest signs anymore. They carried hope. In less than 3 days, a forgotten island had done what few thought possible. It had peacefully overthrown a Western-backed regime without a single foreign soldier or IMF directive. A new leader had emerged not from political elite, but from the ranks of those who once obeyed them. That was the birth of the Refoundation Republic and the beginning of a story that would soon shake Paris, Brussels, and every African capital watching closely. The BBC studio lights flickered for a second. The journalist, visibly caught off guard, tried to smile politely, but the colonel didn't blink. He had already made history in that split second. "Why can't I speak my language, Malagasi?" He repeated, this time slower, every syllable rolling like thunder across an island that had long been told to stay silent. That simple question, spoken without anger, without script, carried centuries of pain. It wasn't just a refusal to speak French. It was a rejection of humiliation itself. For generations, Madagascar's children were told that success meant speaking the language of their colonizer. The colonel shattered that illusion on live television. Within hours, headlines erupted. Madagascar's leader defies France, anti-French sentiment on the rise. But none of those headlines captured the truth. What really happened was spiritual, the rebirth of a nation's dignity. In Paris, the reaction was swift and furious. President Emmanuel Macron's cabinet convened an emergency session denouncing the takeover as unconstitutional and dangerous to regional stability. French commentators, the same who once praised Rajoelina as a modern reformer, now painted Randrian Arena as a militarist populist. But what they feared was not his uniform, it was his independence. Because beneath the polished phrases of diplomacy, France understood what was really at stake. Language is power. Once a people refuse to think, dream, and pray in their master's tongue, they are free. And freedom in the eyes of empire is rebellion. As Western analysts scrambled to explain the Malagasi phenomenon, young Africans from Ouagadougou to Bamako flooded social media with the colonel's clip subtitled and celebrated. They called him the Indian Ocean's Traore. For the youth of the continent, he became proof that courage could be contagious. Burkina Faso's Captain Ibrahim Traoré sent an indirect message during a public speech 2 days later. When a soldier stands for truth, he needs no translation. The French media tried to pivot the narrative, calling it a linguistic stunt, a populist act. Yet the truth was clear. Madagascar, once dismissed as a distant island, had just joined the new Pan-African wave of self-determination, and then came the ripple effect. Within 48 hours, student groups across Senegal, Benin, and even Cameroon held symbolic marches chanting in their native tongues. Hashtags like Danda Speak African and Malagasi First trended globally. What began as a question became a movement, a linguistic revolt against centuries of quiet assimilation. But the shockwaves didn't end there. The African Union called for restraint, yet privately, several diplomats admitted that Madagascar's case may redefine sovereignty. Meanwhile, in Paris, panic turned to paranoia. Editorials in Le Monde warned that France is losing the Indian Ocean. The French Foreign Ministry issued a statement insisting that the language issue was being exaggerated. Yet, on the ground in Antananarivo, the mood was euphoric. Thousands gathered at the Independence Square, waving both the national flag and handmade signs reading, "We are Malagasi, not French shadows." The crowd sang old resistance songs once banned under colonial rule. Elderly women wept as soldiers stood guard not as enforcers, but protectors. That night, when Colonel Randrian Arena appeared on national television, he spoke again, this time entirely in Malagasi. No subtitles, no apology, just conviction. He ended his short address with a phrase that has since become immortal across Africa. "Our ancestors spoke this language under chains. We will speak it in freedom." For Paris, that was the final straw. For Africa, it was the beginning of a new dawn. From the deserts of Niger to the hills of Madagascar, a single truth was spreading fast. The era of translation was over. Africa was ready to speak, think, and lead in its own voice. The morning after the colonel's televised address, Antananarivo woke to a silence that felt sacred. No gunfire, no curfew. Only church bells and the distant murmur of prayers echoing through the hills. For the first time in decades, people felt that their government, or at least its heart, was beating in their own language. The streets that once smelled of tear gas now brimmed with the scent of street food and open laughter. University students painted murals of Colonel Randrian Arena on the walls of the old French consulate. One read, "He spoke for us." Across the island, the atmosphere was electric but peaceful. Youth volunteers began cleaning the capital's roundabouts, scrubbing away graffiti that once demanded resignation, replacing it with messages of unity. The colonel's declaration of a 2-year transitional rule, a military-civilian hybrid government, had surprised many, even his allies. Critics abroad called it a soft coup, yet on the ground people called it the refoundation. The plan was clear: stabilize the economy, reform the constitution, root out corruption, and most symbolically reintroduce Malagasi as the sole official language of governance and education. In schools, teachers began rewriting lesson plans. On national radio, announcers switched effortlessly between Malagasi and English, quietly phasing out French broadcasts. Even the Currency Redesign Committee proposed new notes featuring Malagasi scientists and poets, replacing the colonial figures who had long adorned them. But the change went deeper than policy. It touched something ancestral. Elders in rural villages held evening gatherings under the baobab trees, retelling the story of Queen Ranavalona Winde, the monarch who had once resisted French missionaries. To them, Randrian Arena wasn't just a colonel, he was a continuation of a lineage of defiance. Yet not everyone celebrated. The country's elite businessmen tied to French conglomerates and mining interests felt the ground shifting beneath them. In private circles, they warned that rejecting France could mean losing aid investment and international legitimacy. But the people had heard those warnings before every time someone tried to justify dependency. The African Union, caught between precedent and principle, issued a cautious statement welcoming stability but urging a return to constitutional order. Behind the scenes, however, smaller nations from Guinea to Niger sent quiet messages of support. In Burkina Faso, the public broadcaster replayed clips of Randrian's oath side by side with Ibrahim Traoré's 2022 speech declaring different lands, same struggle. And while Paris fumed, something remarkable unfolded in Madagascar's own corridors of power. Judges resigned from the old constitutional court, citing conflicts of conscience. Civil servants volunteered to take salary cuts to fund the rebuilding of rural clinics. Even former police officers, once ordered to suppress protests, joined community patrols under the slogan, "Serve the people, not the powerful." Still beneath the optimism lurked uncertainty. Would the colonel keep his promise of elections in 2027? Could he rebuild a nation long stripped by foreign corporations and domestic corruption? No one knew. But for once, the people of Madagascar had decided that even imperfect sovereignty was better than perfect submission. As dusk fell over the capital, the new flag, stitched hastily by local women, waved above the palace. Its colors glowed under floodlights powered not by imported fuel, but by a small solar grid assembled by students from the Polytechnic Institute. A symbol, fragile yet alive. The message was clear. This was no mere coup. It was a correction, the people reclaiming their story, one language, one street, one sunrise at a time. While Madagascar celebrated in the streets, the rest of the world watched in uneasy silence. In Washington, D.C., think tanks scrambled to update their Africa briefings. CNN's late-night anchors described Colonel Randrian Arena as the latest chapter in Africa's coup contagion, but the tone was cautious, almost uncertain. After 2 decades of democracy promotion, the United States now faced a question it could barely articulate. What if the people actually supported the soldiers inside the State Department? Analysts divided. Some warned that Madagascar could become another Sahel, a region slipping away from Western influence and turning toward Moscow and Beijing. Others argued that Randrian Arena's message, self-reliance, linguistic pride, economic sovereignty, resonated too deeply to dismiss. One retired diplomat admitted on record, "It's not anti-Western sentiment, it's anti-hypocrisy." Meanwhile, in Paris, denial turned to dread. For the French establishment, Madagascar's revolt wasn't just about one island, it was about the unraveling of an entire post-colonial system. After Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, losing Madagascar meant losing France's last symbolic foothold in the Indian Ocean, a region linking East Africa, India, and the Persian Gulf. Military strategists warned that the Indian Ocean front was collapsing. Editorials in Le Figaro questioned whether the CFA franc long defended as stability would soon be scrapped entirely. Across Africa, reactions were more visceral. From Abidjan to Dar es Salaam, local broadcasters played the BBC clip of Randrian Arena's interview on loop, treating it like a declaration of independence. In Burkina Faso, young soldiers reportedly painted his quote, "Why can't I speak my language?" on barracks walls beside Ibrahim Traoré's image. On social media, the phrase became a rallying cry in Wolof, Swahili, and Zulu, "Speak your mother, not your master." Even Russia, never missing a geopolitical cue, praised Madagascar's new course as a sovereign decision of a free African nation. State-run outlets drew parallels between Randrian Arena and Traoré, portraying both as sons of liberty fighting a modern form of colonialism. Chinese commentators followed suit, but with more restraint, quietly offering development cooperation while avoiding public confrontation with France. And then there was the American public, older skeptical but curious. Veterans and churchgoers who had seen the Cold War unfold began asking different questions online. Why does the U.S. support democracy only when it benefits certain powers? Why is France still dictating terms to nations it once enslaved? Why, after 60 years of independence, do African leaders still need permission to speak their own languages? It was uncomfortable, yet awakening. For many Americans, the story of Madagascar wasn't just about Africa, it was about the universal hunger for dignity, the same impulse that had once driven their own ancestors to rebel against imperial crowns. By the end of that week, world maps looked the same, but the moral lines had shifted. Madagascar had redrawn the meaning of sovereignty not through war or wealth, but through words. And as the colonel's question, "Why can't I speak my language?" echoed across continents, even the most powerful nations found themselves without an easy answer. The world often thinks revolutions begin with rifles. But sometimes they begin with a question. For Madagascar, that question was simple, yet seismic. Why can't I speak my language? Colonel Randrian Arena's refusal to glorify the colonial tongue did more than challenge France's authority. It reminded millions across Africa and beyond that freedom is not just political, it is psychological. A people who reclaim their voice reclaim their destiny. Yet the road ahead is uncertain. History has shown that every leader who stands against empire becomes a target. Thomas Sankara was silenced. Patrice Lumumba was betrayed. Even the boldest visions are fragile when the old world still holds the levers of finance, media, and diplomacy. And already whispers rise from Paris and Brussels predicting economic isolation for Madagascar. But the people seem unfazed, because for the first time in a generation, they feel seen not by the West, but by each other. Across Africa, this awakening is spreading like dawn, breaking over a long night. From Ouagadougou to Antananarivo, young Africans are no longer asking for permission. They're taking ownership of their land, their resources, their future. And in that rising tide, the name Ibrahim Traoré stands as both mentor and mirror, the man who showed that sovereignty is not granted. It's seized through courage and conviction. Still, this is not just Africa's reckoning, it's the world's reflection. Because as global citizens, we all must ask, what does it mean to be free if our minds still speak in someone else's language? Can democracy survive when its roots are planted in dependency? Can dignity thrive when truth must first be translated? These are not questions for Madagascar alone. They are questions for every nation that once knelt to an empire and still bears its mark. And perhaps they are questions for us watching from afar, remembering our own revolutions, and wondering what we would do if our freedom were again in question. So tonight, as the sun sets over the Indian Ocean and the red flag of Madagascar ripples against the wind, remember this moment. A soldier chose silence over submission, identity over imitation, and truth over comfort. Now it's your turn to choose. If you believe that voices like Colonel Randrian Arena's and President Ibrahim Traoré's deserve to be heard beyond borders, share this video. If you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines, subscribe. Because the story of Africa's awakening isn't over, it's only just beginning.